Exposure in its simplest definition is talking about the amount of light you have allowed to reach and be captured by the sensor, or film, to reveal the details and parts of the image you are trying to capture in an image and show to the viewer. Let's go into this in a little bit more detail. So the longer explanation, you know what exposure as a word means, right? You've come into contact with something. You've seen it, or two or more things have interacted with one another. Well, exposure as a photographic term goes all the way back to the old days of photography, before film was even invented, and you just had a wooden box, which was your camera, with a lens that had something to cover the hole, which was your shutter, and inside was a plate of glass that had chemicals coated onto its surface that reacted to light. The chemicals were exposed to the light, and photographers had to time how long they had to let the chemicals be exposed to light by holding the shutter open on their cameras, sometimes just with their hand, for that amount of time. If they did a bad job, it was either too dark or too light. If they did a good job, the photo would be a decent representation of what they saw through the lens or what they were seeing in front of the camera in terms of brightness and details. If an image is too dark overall, it is said to be underexposed because the recording surface hasn't been exposed to the light long enough to properly capture the image information, and so information is lost and cannot be gotten back. Now, if an image is overall too bright, it is said to be overexposed because the recording surface has been exposed to light for too long and information is lost and cannot be gotten back. And if the image looked good, with the right amount of lighting in the right areas, it was said to be a good exposure, or that it had been properly exposed to reveal the details the photographer wanted revealed. Maybe not everything was captured just because of the sensitivity of the chemicals, but the important parts that the photographer wanted captured by the camera were captured. Exposure is just as important now as it was 150 years ago. Why? Because digital works on the exact same principles. Instead of exposing chemicals to light, you're exposing the surface of a digital sensor inside your camera that translates light into digital information that can be reproduced on a computer. The goal of the photographer or cinematographer is always to have the perfect exposure for the message of the image that he or she is trying to communicate. That doesn't mean that everything is evenly exposed. There are plenty of cases where you wouldn't want this. So a dark exposure isn't necessarily bad. Exposure also means that you have to decide what the viewer is to see and what they are not to see. So have a look at this image where I'm going to go ahead and silhouette the model kind of under this pier, looking out at a boat. So it's a very dark image on her, but the details being revealed are what I want you to see. It's not underexposed, it's the correct exposure for this image where I'm trying to get a silhouette. Now, a lot of time your teacher will jump right in and tell you that there are three main ways to control your light using your camera. The first is the sensitivity of the sensor inside the camera that is recording the light. In today's digital cameras, you can change the sensitivity of the sensor radically, and this will really change the exposure you get. 2, the speed at which the shutter opens and closes. This is called shutter speed. 3, the size of the opening in the lens which lets light through onto the sensor. The bigger the opening, the more light that gets let in. But again, I want to remind you to think of light first. Before you think about any of your camera settings or your lens settings, ask yourself if you're happy with the light you're about to capture. Really look at your light and remember that even at the simplest level, you do have some degree of control over it. Now let's look at this with our lovely model here, and I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. Now, if you look right now, she's standing in some very harsh sunlight. So as you can see what's happening in terms of the shadows on her face. If I was to take a photo here, okay, hold on. The light ends up being really harsh on her skin and on her face just because of that's the sunlight that we have. So, go ahead. Okay, tweaking my settings here. Taking a photo like that, the light is very strong and harsh, and that's not really pleasing for skin. So when it comes to controlling light, to make sure you have the best shot that you can get, realize just by moving your model or whatever you're photographing into a different area, you can get a much better, much softer look. So we're gonna go ahead and walk over here to this table. Come on over. So now if you see, the light is much softer over here. As you can see, there's like a little bit of light falling on the back of her head. It's just kind of coming through the trees, which is really nice. And this is really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about controlling light. It's don't just take the light that you get, see how you can get the best light that's there. So now I'm going to take another photo and just kind of show you what this looks like in terms of photographically, just changing from full bright to shade. Okay. Nice, good. And now just look a little bit that way. There you go. Okay. So now if you look at the photos, you're going to see that the light on her skin is much more pleasing, and it's much more flattering for her as a model and for the photo you're taking. So there's obviously less light in the shade. There was way more light in the sun, but now that we've moved her over here, the exposure is very different and a very different effect of the light on her skin and how she looks overall. Now remember, because the most vital factor that affects exposure is, of course, how much light and what type of light is present. I know, I keep saying it, and I promise I'll stop stressing this so much at some point. So now that I've reminded you again that examining the light comes first and then monkeying with the settings you have on the camera, let's talk about monkeying with the settings on the camera, starting with the first one, sensitivity to light, or ISO, or as some people call it, ISO.